The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the manicured streets of Whispering Pines, a gated community that prided itself on perfection. The grass was always trimmed just right, the sidewalks washed every Friday, and the houses all matched with eerie symmetry. To an outsider, it looked like a slice of suburban heaven. But for Rachel, a single mother and pediatric nurse, Whispering Pines was less about luxury and more about safety. After her ex-husband left years ago, all she wanted was a calm, quiet place to raise her daughter, somewhere her child could breathe freely away from judgment and chaos. Her daughter, Emma, was 9 years old and wheelchair-bound since birth due to a rare neuromuscular disorder. Despite her limited mobility, Emma's spirit radiated joy. She was the kind of child who could light up a room with her laugh and draw masterpieces with crayons clutched in tiny, unsteady hands. Her favorite things in the world were sunflowers, pink cupcakes, her scruffy therapy dog, Nibbles, and planning pretend tea parties with her plush elephant named Winston. Rachel often marveled at Emma's resilience. There were days when Emma would struggle to grip a spoon or move herself between her chair and the couch, yet she never complained. She called her wheelchair rocket wheels and insisted it made her faster than superheroes. But Rachel knew that behind the courage was a little girl who just wanted to be accepted, to be seen for who she was, not the chair she sat in. That's why this birthday was special. For months, Rachel had worked extra shifts, sometimes double, sometimes overnight, just to save up for Emma's 10th birthday. Emma had told her last December, with a sparkle in her eye, that all she wanted was a garden party with my friends and a cake shaped like a sunflower. Rachel promised her it would happen. Every cent from side gigs, every spare dollar from tightening the grocery list went toward this one day. She found a local baker who agreed to create a custom sunflower cake at a discount. A friend from the hospital offered to help with decorations, and the community park behind their townhouse had the perfect shaded lawn to set up a small party. Whispering Pines, however, was not a place that welcomed imperfect displays. The community was governed by a strict and often overreaching homeowners association, or HOA. Rachel hadn't had many run-ins with them since moving in 2 years ago, but she had heard the stories. Fines issued for lawn chairs that weren't beige, letters sent for wind chimes deemed audibly disruptive, and HOA officers showing up unannounced to scold residents for unapproved flower pots. It was always subtle, always polite on the surface, yet underneath, the control was suffocating. Rachel's only real encounter had been a year ago, when she received a reminder that hanging wind socks on her balcony was against uniform exterior presentation codes. She took them down. She didn't argue. She didn't want trouble. Now, just a week before Emma's party, trouble arrived anyway. It began with an envelope slipped under their door. There was no postage, just a neatly folded letter on HOA stationery. Rachel opened it, expecting another rule reminder, maybe something about trash bins. Instead, it read, "Ms. Whitaker, we understand you are planning a gathering on the community lawn. Please be reminded that outdoor functions must be approved at least 3 weeks in advance and must not obstruct pathways or present safety hazards. Due to previous incidents, equipment such as ramps or wheeled apparatus on grass may be restricted for maintenance concerns. Please submit your event proposal for review." Rachel stared at the words wheeled apparatus like they were venom. It wasn't just a generic rule. It was pointed, passive, cowardly. She knew exactly what they meant. Emma's wheelchair. Trembling with frustration, Rachel called the HOA office, only to be greeted by a voicemail stating that all inquiries must be submitted online. She filled out the request form that night, carefully noting that the party would be fewer than 15 people with zero amplified sound and would only last 2 hours. She made sure to mention that her daughter used a mobility aid and that accommodations would be minimal, just a small ramp for access and some folding tables for guests. 3 days passed with no response. Emma, meanwhile, was bursting with anticipation. She had made paper invitations and handed them to friends from school. She practiced what she would say when cutting the cake, rehearsing it with Winston the elephant. She even picked out a yellow dress and asked Rachel to sew little sunflowers on the hem. The day before the party, Rachel finally received an email from the HOA board. Your request has been reviewed. While we cannot approve use of the central lawn due to recent maintenance and potential weather-related damage, you are welcome to host your gathering on your personal driveway or porch. Thank you for your cooperation. Rachel, reread it 4 times. Driveway? Porch? That wasn't a party space, it was concrete and cramped. There was no shade, no space to accommodate Emma's friends, some of whom also had disabilities. And the cake, the entire sunflower garden theme, was designed for the park lawn. The HOA had effectively canceled her daughter's dream birthday with a couple of polite sentences. Furious but unwilling to disappoint her child, Rachel made a decision. She would host the party on the lawn anyway. It wasn't fair. The lawn was public, and Emma deserved more than a pity party on the driveway. As night fell, Rachel walked out onto the small patch of grass behind her townhouse. Fireflies blinked near the bushes. The lawn was soft, well-kept, and wide open. There was no reason Emma couldn't roll her wheelchair across it. No reason a handful of children couldn't enjoy an afternoon here. But as she turned to head back inside, Rachel noticed something strange. A dark SUV was idling near the cul-de-sac entrance, headlights off. She couldn't see the driver, but she felt eyes on her. After a moment, the engine rumbled and the car slowly drove off. She didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere deep down, Rachel felt it. This wasn't just about a cake or a chair. Something uglier was brewing beneath the perfect lawns and silent smiles. And it was watching them. Tomorrow was Emma's birthday, and no matter what came, Rachel was going to make sure her daughter had her moment, even if the entire HOA came down on them. The morning of Emma's birthday arrived with bright skies and birdsong. Rachel had been up since dawn, setting up folding chairs, hanging yellow streamers between the trees, and carefully unboxing the sunflower-shaped cake from the local bakery. She was exhausted, but the look on Emma's face made it all worth it. Her daughter was beaming, wrapped in her yellow dress with sunflower patches, hair in loose braids with matching clips. The sparkle in her eyes was the kind Rachel hadn't seen in months. This wasn't just a party, it was a celebration of survival, strength, and joy in a world that too often overlooked kids like Emma. Guests began trickling in. A couple of Emma's classmates arrived with their parents. A friend from therapy brought her service dog, which instantly clicked with nibbles. Laughter rang across the small park lawn, and even Rachel allowed herself to believe, for a few hours, that everything was going to be okay. Until she saw the woman in beige. She was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, arms crossed over her chest, clipboard in hand, eyes squinting like she was inspecting termites. Dressed in a pearl-button blouse and tan slacks, she had that unmistakable air of self-importance, the kind that screamed HOA lifer. Rachel didn't need to be told who she was. This had to be her, the one behind the letter, the denied request, the quiet cruelty dressed as policy. Her name was Dolores Hannigan, but everyone in the neighborhood just called her Madam President. She had ruled over the Whispering Pines HOA board for nearly a decade. A widow in her late 50s, Dolores made it her mission to preserve community standards which conveniently aligned with her personal preferences. Rumors circulated about her petty vendettas. A single mom fined for painting her door teal, a veteran chastised for flying an American flag without preclearance, and even a widower cited for planting a tree without HOA landscaping approval. She had no children, no job, and no joy, just rules and a deep resentment for anyone who didn't fit her mold. Rachel walked toward her, heart thudding. "Good morning," she said with measured politeness. Dolores didn't smile. This area was not approved for events. Rachel gestured calmly toward the kids. "It's just a few friends. No music, no alcohol, no property damage. Just some chairs and a cake for my daughter's birthday." Dolores's eyes flicked to Emma, who was laughing in her chair while blowing soap bubbles with a friend. Her expression twisted ever so slightly, as if the mere presence of a wheelchair on grass offended her sense of order. "I sent In email, Dolores said, holding up her clipboard like a badge, "The lawn is under post-irrigation protection protocol. Wheelchairs and other rolling equipment can compress the soil and cause damage." Rachel inhaled sharply. "You mean the children playing tag aren't a concern, but my daughter's mobility aid is?" Dolores sniffed. "Children run naturally. Wheels are manufactured. The HOA guidelines are clear." "They're not," Rachel shot back. "I read every page of that handbook. There's no mention of wheelchairs being restricted from common grounds." Dolores took a step closer. "This isn't about discrimination, Ms. Whitaker. It's about compliance. If you had followed proper channels, I did." Rachel snapped, voice rising now. "I submitted a request. You denied it without reason. And now you're trying to ruin a 10-year-old's birthday over your personal bias." For a beat, Dolores said nothing. Then, in the fakest smile Rachel had ever seen, she said, "Well, if that's how you feel, perhaps a fine will help you reconsider your choices next time." She turned as if to leave, but paused. Her eyes landed on the beautifully decorated cake, sitting under a small canopy, a masterpiece of icing petals and sunflower designs. Rachel stepped instinctively in front of her. "Don't." Dolores cocked her head, smug. "Are you threatening a board member, Ms. Whitaker?" "I'm protecting my daughter." Dolores didn't move. For a terrifying second, it looked like she might just reach out and destroy it right there. But instead, she leaned forward and said under her breath, "That child should not be on the lawn. This is a community, not a care facility." Rachel's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't even speak. The cruelty of the words, the vicious intent masked behind clipped civility, it paralyzed her. Dolores offered one final sneer and walked off. But the damage was done. Emma had seen everything. She didn't understand the full conversation, but she had heard enough. The tone, the expression, the look her mother wore afterward. She rolled herself over and quietly asked, "Mom, am I not supposed to be here?" Rachel knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, you belong anywhere your heart wants to go. This is your birthday. No one can take that from you." Emma smiled, but there was a flicker of sadness behind her eyes now, a whisper of doubt. That's when Rachel knew this wasn't over. Dolores wasn't done, and neither was she. The guests tried to keep the mood light, but the air had shifted. Parents whispered, kids played more cautiously, and Rachel's hands trembled every time she reached for the drink cooler. She kept checking over her shoulder, waiting for something to happen. A neighbor report, another visit, a security guard. Dolores never returned that afternoon. But a fine envelope did, hand-delivered, folded tight, left on the cake table before the party even ended. No words, just a number. $500 for unauthorized use of common ground and soil compression violations. It wasn't about the lawn. It was never about the lawn. It was about Emma, her existence, her joy, her visibility. They were a threat to the perfectly trimmed lie that Whispering Pines tried so hard to maintain. Rachel watched as Emma, still trying to enjoy her big day, offered a cupcake to a boy from school. She smiled, but it wasn't the same smile from this morning. And in that moment, something in Rachel hardened. The storm had started, and she was going to make sure Dolores never forgot the day she tried to crush a child's joy with a clipboard. The day after the birthday party should have been a day of rest, a day for leftover cupcakes, thank you notes, and flipping through phone photos of smiling children. Instead, Rachel awoke to the sound of her doorbell ringing at 6:42 a.m. She scrambled out of bed, thinking it might be a neighbor returning a forgotten jacket or a delivery mistake. But it wasn't. It was a man in a cheap gray polo shirt with a Whispering Pines logo stitched over his chest and a tablet in hand. "Ms. Whitaker," he asked without making eye contact, "you've been issued a formal citation for property defacement rule violation and unauthorized gathering. This requires acknowledgement and signature." Rachel blinked, groggy and confused. "Defacement of what?" He showed her pictures, photos taken during the party. Some were angled high, clearly from upstairs windows. Others were taken from a distance. Someone had been photographing them the whole time. One image showed Emma's wheelchair positioned on the edge of the grass, another zoomed in on the folding chairs. One even focused on a smudge of frosting that had dripped onto the lawn. They're calling that vandalism? Rachel asked in disbelief. Ma'am, I'm just here to get the form signed. If not, this escalates to board review. Rachel refused to sign. She told him to leave. But the damage was already done. Within hours, she received 3 emails. One from the HOA board stating that she was now on probationary watch, one from their community app with her name listed under pending violators, and one from her HOA account charging her a second fine, $1,000 for noncompliance and continued disregard for community preservation. She stared at the screen in stunned silence. Emma came into the room, still in her pajamas, and asked, "Are we in trouble?" Rachel didn't know what to say. She smiled weakly, kissed her forehead, and said, "No, honey, just grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But she was worried. Deeply. Things got worse quickly. Over the next 2 days, Rachel began noticing strange behavior around the neighborhood. Neighbors she had previously waved to now avoided eye contact. A friendly woman across the street who used to compliment Emma's artwork crossed to the other sidewalk when she saw them coming. Rachel's trash cans were tagged for improper placement, even though she'd always kept them behind the fence. A warning note was taped to her door for having unauthorized decor, referring to a birthday balloon still tied to the porch railing. They were building a case, layer by layer, infraction by infraction. It felt like war. But the breaking point came on a cloudy Thursday, just 4 days after the party. Rachel was at work, a double shift at the pediatric ICU. Emma had a half day at school, and her regular babysitter, Marcia, had agreed to pick her up and bring her home. Marcia was a gentle, retired woman from 2 blocks over who adored Emma and treated her like her own granddaughter. At 3:27 p.m., Rachel's phone buzzed mid-round. It was Marcia. Her voice trembled. "Rachel, I don't know what happened. We came back and it's just, I'm so sorry, honey. The cake, the porch, it's all." Rachel asked her to slow down. Marcia explained that when they got to the house, the front porch was splattered with what looked like frosting, mud, and crushed decorations. The remains of the leftover cake, which Rachel had saved in the fridge for Emma to enjoy all week, had been dumped and smeared across the railing. Streamers were torn down. One of Emma's art projects, a sunflower drawing she'd taped to the front window, had been ripped and left on the ground, partially soaked in what smelled like spoiled milk. Emma had seen all of it. Marcia tried to clean up while comforting her, but Emma had shut down, completely silent, just staring at the mess. Rachel rushed home. The moment she walked up the porch steps and saw the damage with her own eyes, something inside her snapped. Not just anger, something colder, sharper. The kind of clarity that only comes when a mother sees her child's joy turn to ash. This wasn't just a message, it was an escalation, an attack. She checked the doorbell camera. It had been mysteriously disabled. She called the HOA. No answer. She filed a police report. The officer took notes, but didn't sound hopeful. "Unless you have footage or a witness, it's just vandalism," he said. "Could be neighborhood kids." But Rachel knew better. This wasn't random. Later that evening, Emma finally spoke. Her voice was small, almost too quiet to hear. "Was it the lady with the clipboard?" she asked. Rachel knelt down, tears burning her eyes. "I don't know, baby, but it's going to stop. I promise." Emma looked up at her. "Do people hate me because I'm in rocket wheels?" That question shattered her. Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she held her daughter close, buried her face in her hair, and swore in her heart that this wouldn't go unanswered. She would find out who did this. She would expose every inch of corruption that protected them. The HOA wanted a compliant resident, someone who stayed quiet, paid fines, and followed rules no matter how unjust. What they got instead was a mother who was done being polite. The next morning, Rachel called out sick. She packed up her laptop, a folder of all the letters and fines, and her camera. Then she drove to City Hall, because if the HOA wouldn't listen, she'd find someone who would. And if no one else cared, Then she burned the entire illusion of Whispering Pines down to its polished, poisoned roots with truth, evidence, and justice. Because this wasn't about a cake anymore. It was about the dignity of a little girl in rocket wheels. Rachel had never felt more alone, yet more determined. The warm facade of Whispering Pines had cracked, revealing something cold and calculated underneath. And now, after the vandalism of her home and the emotional toll on her daughter, she could no longer afford to play by their rules. It was time to fight back with facts, law, and a mother's fire that burned too deeply to extinguish. She began at City Hall, armed with a binder full of documents, emails, letters, citations, photos, and a timeline of harassment. Rachel requested a meeting with the town's ADA compliance officer, a firm but kind man named Victor Harper. He reviewed her materials carefully, his face tightening as he turned the pages. When he came to the image of Emma's destroyed sunflower cake, he paused for a long moment. This looks like deliberate discrimination, he finally said. Wheelchair usage restricted from lawn. That's a red flag. Rachel nodded. And they keep using coded language, wheeled apparatus, soil disruption, aesthetic harmony. But it's always about my daughter. No other families get treated like this. Victor tapped his pen against the edge of the table. Let me ask, has the HOA ever officially adopted these supposed lawn rules? Are there meeting minutes, votes recorded, or amendments filed with the city? Rachel shook her head. That's just it. I've asked for bylaws and updates, and they gave me a generic handbook from years ago. No records of any changes. Victor leaned back in his chair. That's not just unethical, it could be illegal. Under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, if they're enforcing rules that specifically impact your daughter's access, they could be liable. Hope flared in Rachel's chest for the first time in weeks. Victor connected her with a local disability rights attorney, Natalie Ruiz, who immediately agreed to help. Within 48 hours, Natalie filed a formal ADA grievance with the HOA and launched a public records request to review their legal filings, meeting minutes, and financial records. What came back stunned them all. Over the past 5 years, Dolores Hannigan, the HOA president, had quietly been altering community regulations through executive discretion. Instead of holding board votes, she was issuing mandates under a clause that allowed emergency decisions during preservation risk periods. The clause had been meant for things like storm damage or gas leaks, yet Dolores had invoked it 18 times in the last year alone, including to ban mobility equipment on fragile landscapes. Worse, some of the fines and fees collected under these violations didn't appear in the official financial reports. Rachel now had something explosive, evidence of both discrimination and financial misconduct. But before she went public, she wanted the board to have a chance to do the right thing. So she submitted a formal appeal to the HOA, demanding they drop the fines, issue a written apology to Emma, and reverse any rule that restricted accessibility. The response was swift, denied, without explanation. And just 2 days later, Rachel received yet another violation notice, $250 for inappropriate signage, citing the small chalkboard in her window that read, "Every child deserves joy." That was the final straw. Rachel partnered with Natalie to draft a cease and desist letter, notifying the HOA of pending legal action and requesting a mediation hearing. Meanwhile, Victor referred Rachel to Channel 8 News, where a local reporter named Marcy Delgado was known for exposing shady HOAs and corrupt local governance. When Marcy visited Rachel's house, Emma greeted her wearing her sunflower dress, still determined to smile. That was all it took. Marcy agreed to run the story. Within days, whispers turned to noise. The news crew recorded interviews with Rachel, neighbors who had witnessed Karen's aggressive behavior, and even Marcia, the babysitter, who spoke tearfully about the destroyed porch and the emotional damage it caused. Suddenly, Rachel wasn't alone anymore. One neighbor, Craig, a quiet Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke, came forward with a file of his own, 8 years' worth of HOA bullying that started when he installed a ramp to help his injured dog get inside. Another woman, Jolene, admitted she had once been on the board but quit after Dolores rejected a request for accessible parking near the playground. The dots began to connect. Dolores wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting anyone who didn't fit her ideal community mold: veterans, disabled residents, single mothers, mixed families, all in the name of standards. The board had looked the other way. Rachel and her new allies devised a plan. They requested an open community meeting under the HOA charter. By law, once a quorum of residents petitioned for a vote, the board was required to allow a public forum. Rachel didn't just petition. She canvassed. She knocked on doors. She emailed, posted flyers, and rallied the silent majority of residents who had been living in quiet fear for too long. They secured the signatures. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Dolores didn't know that her reckoning was just a week away. In the meantime, the neighborhood began to shift. Children who used to avoid Emma began to wave again. One mother brought over fresh cookies and whispered, "We've been scared of speaking up. Thank you." Another left a folded note under Rachel's doormat that read, "Your daughter is braver than all of us. We see her now." Rachel shared the note with Emma that night. The little girl traced the handwriting with her fingers, then looked up and whispered, "Does this mean I can have a birthday next year too?" Rachel knelt down, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and said, "Yes, sweetheart. And this time, no one will take your cake." Because this wasn't just about fines, lawns, or a ruin party. It was about drawing a line in the dirt that no bully, clipboard or not, would ever be allowed to cross again. By the time Thursday arrived, the cracks in the HOA's once impenetrable armor were beginning to widen. For the first time in years, the community of Whispering Pines wasn't afraid of the board. They were angry. Rachel could feel it in the way people nodded at her now. How neighbors who once avoided her were suddenly stopping by with documents, screenshots, and old HOA letters that seemed eerily similar to hers. Dolores's pattern of control was no longer just a rumor. It was a web of harassment, selectively spun around the vulnerable and the different. Rachel had spent the last several days preparing with the kind of intensity she used to bring to pediatric trauma cases. This wasn't a birthday cake anymore. It was war. Natalie Ruiz, her attorney, had compiled a bulletproof presentation. Discriminatory practices backed by emails, financial inconsistencies drawn directly from public HOA filings, and most damning of all, proof that the HOA had never formally voted on the policies used to target Emma. Rachel had created a timeline of events with photos, fines, letters, and incident reports. And Victor, the ADA officer, agreed to attend the meeting as an official observer. But Rachel knew that logic and law alone wouldn't win a crowd. She needed truth. So she made one final risky decision. She invited Channel 8 News back, and this time they brought a full camera crew. The HOA meeting was held in the Whispering Pines clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls, stackable chairs, and a mounted projector no one had used in years. But tonight, every seat was full. Residents packed in, some standing along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation. Eyes flicked toward Rachel, some curious, others admiring. A few still hesitant, unsure where to land. At exactly 6 p.m., Dolores Hannigan walked in wearing her signature cream-colored blazer and an expression that teetered between smug and suspicious. When she saw the cameras, she faltered. Just for a moment. Then, she straightened her shoulders and marched to the podium. "We'll begin with roll call," she announced, her voice taut, followed by a brief reminder of our decorum policy. Then, we'll move on to community comments. Rachel stood before she was invited. "I believe we have the floor under the petition for open resident hearing," she said calmly. "Per HOA Charter Rule 3.2. Dolores hesitated. There was a ripple of quiet murmurs, then a forced smile. "Yes, of course. Ms. Whitaker, proceed." Rachel moved to the center of the room with a USB drive and plugged it into the projector. The first image filled the screen. Emma in her sunflower dress, beaming beside the cake, moments before it was destroyed. A hush fell over the room. Then came the letters, the surveillance photos, the wheeled apparatus citation. Then, slowly, the fines, the ADA grievance, the financial discrepancies, and a timeline showing just how Dolores had manipulated HOA rules for years, without votes, without transparency, and always against the most vulnerable. The turning point came when Victor Harper stood up. He introduced himself formally and then stated in clear legal language that the HOA's treatment of the Whitaker family violated multiple federal statutes, including the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Several residents gasped. Then came the testimonies. Craig, the Vietnam vet, stood and told how Dolores fined him over a ramp for his aging dog. Jolene, the former board member, explained how she was pushed out after advocating for more accessibility. A young couple who'd remained silent until now revealed how they were told not to display pride flags because it compromised community values. Each voice added a nail to the coffin. Then Dolores snapped. Red-faced and trembling, she interrupted Rachel mid-sentence, slamming her hand on the table. "This is a witch hunt. This is personal. That woman has manipulated you all with her sob story and her hurt, disabled daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. It was over. The board members, most of whom had been handpicked by Dolores over the years, looked stunned. One of them, a nervous man named Ken, cleared his throat and said, I had no idea some of this was happening. Dolores, is it true we haven't had a proper vote on these policy changes? Dolores stared at him like he'd betrayed her, but it didn't matter anymore. Rachel stepped back to the mic. Her voice was calm, but unshakably firm. "This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. This is about my daughter being made to feel ashamed for existing in a place we all pay to live in. This is about every single one of you who thought you were alone in being targeted. You weren't. You were just quieter than the one with the clipboard." Applause broke out, first scattered, then growing. The board voted on the spot to suspend Dolores pending a formal investigation. Ken motioned to initiate a special election to restructure the HOA. Natalie handed out informational packets on how to submit complaints and recover unlawfully charged fines. Victor confirmed that the Department of Housing would begin its review immediately. And as for Dolores, she stood, silent, red-faced, and completely alone as the news cameras zoomed in. Rachel didn't gloat. She didn't cheer. She simply turned to Emma, who sat in her chair near the front row, holding Winston the stuffed elephant. Emma gave a little thumbs up. Rachel smiled and mouthed, "It's over." But it wasn't just over. It was the beginning of something better. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. By Friday morning, Dolores Hannigan's name was no longer listed on the Whispering Pines HOA website. Her personal bio, once proudly posted with phrases like defender of neighborhood values and tenacious steward of order, had been deleted entirely. The office phone rang nonstop. Emails flooded in. And by Monday, a large white notice had been taped to the door of the HOA clubhouse. Pursuant to Board Resolution 11-47, Dolores Hannigan is hereby suspended from all HOA-related duties pending an independent review. All community members are encouraged to submit formal complaints to the compliance office. It was official. The tyrant had fallen. But it wasn't just the position she lost. It was her reputation. And in a place like Whispering Pines, that was everything. Channel 8 ran a two-part special titled Power, Prejudice, and the HOA President, The Collapse of Whispering Pines' Reign of Control. Clips from the community meeting aired across the region. The footage of Dolores losing her temper and referencing Rachel's disabled daughter became the highlight of the exposé. Even national disability rights organizations began sharing the story. Overnight, Rachel's inbox was filled with messages of support, solidarity, and similar stories from families across the country. People weren't just angry at Dolores, they were inspired by Emma. And Emma? She seemed to grow taller with every passing day. Rachel watched her daughter blossom again. The anxiety that had clouded Emma's smile began to fade. She started painting again, making new drawings filled with color and joy. She even asked if she could invite some friends over to paint a big mural on their backyard fence, one that said, "Different is beautiful." Rachel agreed instantly. Meanwhile, the board investigation into Dolores turned up even more dirt. It wasn't just selective rule enforcement or ADA violations. Dolores had funneled fines into a beautification fund that she controlled exclusively. That fund, as it turned out, paid for her personal landscaping, a new patio, and monthly consulting fees to a fake contractor who turned out to be her cousin. She wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal. Rachel's attorney, Natalie, worked with the ADA and a civil rights group to prepare a class action lawsuit. Several other families joined in. The HOA's insurance company stepped in to mitigate the fallout, and a full audit was ordered by the County Housing Commission. Facing mounting legal pressure and public disgrace, Dolores finally broke her silence with a pitiful letter addressed to the community. To my fellow residents of Whispering Pines, I regret that my actions have caused distress and division. I always acted in the interest of our community's integrity. Any misunderstandings were never intended to harm. I will be stepping away to focus on my health and well-being. The letter didn't mention Emma, or Rachel, or the hundreds of dollars stolen. It was classic Dolores, self-centered and sanitized. But no one was fooled. Rachel read the letter once and tossed it in the trash. But not everything was serious. Some neighbors responded with humor. One morning, Rachel walked outside to find a sunflower-shaped balloon tied to her mailbox with a note. No fines this time. The next day, someone slipped a cupcake recipe into her mailbox labeled Emergency Cake Recovery Plan. Even the once silent Craig, the veteran, invited Rachel and Emma to his porch for lemonade and a chess game. The community had been fractured for years, but now it was healing. And as the weeks passed, the HOA transformed. The special election was held, and for the first time, residents actually showed up to vote. Rachel declined to run, but she nominated someone else, Tanya Green, a disabled former teacher who had moved in last year with her wife and 2 adopted children. Tanya won in a landslide. The new board immediately began overhauling the bylaws, clarifying accessibility protections, capping fine amounts, and establishing a transparent complaint system. Rachel was invited to serve as a community advisor, a role she accepted with pride. And Emma? She was now a symbol of something bigger. At the next community picnic, the same one Dolores once tried to deny her, Emma was asked to cut the ribbon for the newly paved, accessible path that ran across the common lawn. It led directly to a small sunflower garden the board planted in her honor. The sign beside it read, "Emma's Way, every child belongs." Rachel stood nearby, tears silently rolling down her cheeks as her daughter beamed in front of the crowd, holding Winston the stuffed elephant with one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. The crowd clapped and cheered, but Emma turned to Rachel first and whispered, "Is this like my second birthday?" Rachel smiled, voice cracking. "It's better than a birthday, honey. It's a new beginning." Dolores, for all her cruelty and control, had been defeated by the very people she tried to silence. And what she had never understood was that rules don't build communities, compassion does. It wasn't the fences or flowers that made Whispering Pine strong. It was the people who lived there, who fought back, who stood up when standing was hardest. In the end, the tyrant had collapsed not because of some grand, powerful force, but because of one little girl in rocket wheels who refused to be invisible. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of cinnamon and fresh-cut grass as neighbors bustled around the Whispering Pines Community Center, hanging decorations and arranging folding chairs. Children giggled in the distance, chasing each other between carefully manicured hedges, and dogs barked happily from behind fences. It was the first time in years that the neighborhood felt alive, like a place where joy wasn't just tolerated but welcomed. In the heart of it all stood Rachel, dressed in a simple denim jacket and sunflower earrings, watching her daughter Emma guide a small group of children in decorating cupcakes. Frosting smeared across her cheek, Emma looked up, locked eyes with her mom, and gave a proud little nod before returning to her work. Her wheelchair was now adorned with rainbow streamers and a tiny flag that read, "HOA can't stop me." The transformation was surreal. Just months ago, this very spot had been the site of a shouting match where Dolores Hannigan had tried to strip a little girl of her joy, her dignity, and her place in the community. Now it was filled with laughter, acceptance, and something Whispering Pines hadn't known in a long time: peace. The new HOA, led by Tanya Green, had lived up to its promises. Accessibility ramps had been installed. Rules were rewritten in plain language, with fairness and inclusivity at their core. The community garden had a new section named the Kindness Patch, where residents could plant whatever they wanted without approval forms, fines, or harassment. And perhaps most telling of all, the lawn signs that once read, "No street parking," HOA enforced were replaced with signs that simply said, "You belong here." Rachel hadn't realized how heavy the weight on her shoulders had been until it was finally gone. No more surprise fines. No more late-night anxiety about letters in the mailbox. No more holding her daughter back for fear of offending the wrong person. They were free. And with that freedom came something else, healing. Rachel had never thought of herself as an activist. She was a single mother, a survivor of grief, just trying to make it through the day with enough energy to read Emma a bedtime story. But what Dolores had unleashed, however cruel, had awakened a fierce protector in her. And once that fire was lit, it couldn't be extinguished. So when Tanya approached her with a bold idea, a neighborhood mentorship program for families with disabled children, Rachel said yes without hesitation. She helped design the curriculum, speak at town meetings, and even partnered with a local nonprofit to provide donated mobility aids, learning materials, and therapy resources to anyone in need. What started as a small initiative quickly grew into a model replicated by other HOA communities across the state. Rachel wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a voice. And Emma? She was the heart. At one of the mentorship events, a young girl in leg braces shyly rolled up to Emma and asked if she could pet Winston the elephant. Emma nodded, then took the girl's hand and said, "He's magic, you know. When you hold him, bullies go away." The girl squeezed Winston tight and smiled for the first time all day. Rachel watched the interaction from across the room, and her throat tightened. The road to this moment had been long, painful, and messy. But standing there, among smiling children, supportive parents, and a community rebuilt from ashes, Rachel realized something vital. The storm hadn't broken them. It had revealed them. It had revealed the cracks in the system, the hidden strength inside a grieving mother, the courage in a child's quiet defiance, and the truth that no amount of bylaws or titles could suppress the human spirit when it was backed by love. Dolores, meanwhile, had disappeared from Whispering Pines entirely. After the lawsuit settlement, which included a formal apology, community service, and a massive restitution payment, she sold her home and left town. Rumors spread that she'd moved in with her sister 3 states away, but no one really cared. In the end, she became what she always feared most: irrelevant. Rachel didn't waste energy thinking about her anymore. She had bigger things to focus on, like planning Emma's 2nd birthday, which they decided would become an annual event. Not just to celebrate that traumatic day they reclaimed, but to honor how far they'd come. They even gave it a name: Sunflower Day. Every year on that date, the community now gathered to share stories of perseverance, donate to disability advocacy groups, and reflect on how compassion had saved them from collapse. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops and cast golden streaks across the lawn, Rachel and Emma stood on the newly built stage with Tanya beside them. The crowd quieted as Rachel approached the mic. "I never imagined we'd be standing here," she began, her voice steady. "When I moved to Whispering Pines, I just wanted a safe place for my daughter. What I found instead was a fight I never asked for, but one I would gladly take on again if it meant getting to this moment." She paused and turned to Emma. "My daughter taught me that you don't have to stand to take a stand. You just need to know what's right, and refuse to be quiet about it." The crowd erupted in applause. Emma waved proudly from her chair, raising Winston high above her head like a trophy. Rachel wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the sight. The people who once looked the other way when injustice happened were now cheering for a little girl in a wheelchair. The lawn that once forbade her presence now bore her name. And the mother who had once doubted her own strength had become the community's unshakable anchor. Redemption didn't come in the form of revenge. It came through change, And as the night faded into laughter, music, and shared cupcakes, Rachel understood one final truth. They hadn't just changed their neighborhood, they'd rewritten the rules of what community meant. When people first hear the story, they fixate on the outrageous headline: HOA, Karen destroyed a child's birthday cake. They picture the villain, a bitter, entitled woman barking orders about grass and regulations. And they're right to be angry. Dolores Hannigan's actions were cruel, demeaning, and shockingly personal. But if that's all they see, they're missing the deeper truth. Because the real villain wasn't just Dolores. It was the system that handed her the power. The system that let her enforce rules with no oversight. The system that viewed accessibility as an inconvenience. That treated disability like disruption. That allowed a woman like Dolores to rise unchecked, not in spite of her prejudice, but because of how well it aligned with the HOA's warped idea of order. Dolores may have held the knife that sliced Emma's cake into the dirt, but the HOA rules, crafted in secret, enforced with fear, put that knife in her hand. And that's what Rachel came to understand in the months that followed. This wasn't just about a birthday party. It was about a structure that routinely punishes the vulnerable while protecting those in power. About neighbors who stayed silent as injustice happened just feet from their doors. About a boardroom full of signatures that believed a lawn's appearance mattered more than a child's dignity. Emma wasn't the first child denied joy in Whispering Pines. She was just the first whose mother refused to bow her head. That's the part that matters. Not the cruelty, but the courage. Rachel stood up, not just for her daughter, but for every parent too afraid to speak. Every disabled child taught to be invisible. Every neighbor who told themselves, "It's not my business," while watching someone else be trampled under the weight of bureaucratic cruelty. When Emma sat in her wheelchair, frosting still on her cheeks, and whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" the world had a choice to make. They could say nothing, or they could finally say enough. And Rachel said it first. Ableism doesn't always wear a sneer. Sometimes it shows up as a policy, a regulation, a clause buried in a homeowner's manual that pretends to protect the community, but in reality, targets the ones who don't fit in. That's how injustice survives, hidden behind paperwork delivered with a smile. The real fight wasn't over a cake. It was over who gets to feel at home and who doesn't. Emma taught the neighborhood that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rolls quietly through the grass, decorated in rainbow streamers, and changes hearts simply by refusing to disappear. Her smile that day became more powerful than any fine, louder than any HOA threat, more permanent than any regulation etched in ink. But let's be clear, Emma should have never had to be brave in the first place. No child should have to carry that weight. No parent should be forced to defend their child's humanity against a policy manual. No one should have to go to war over a cake. That's why this story matters. Because it's not just about one family or one neighborhood. It's about all of us. It's about every person who's ever felt small, unwelcome, or out of place in a world designed to keep them that way. It's about the fences we build around our comfort and who we keep out by doing so. And it's about what we do next. We have a choice, to be silent or to be loud, to let the Karens of the world keep writing the rules, or to tear those rules down and start again with empathy at the center. This story is your invitation to speak when it's uncomfortable, to question what's normal, to stand beside the Emmas of the world, even when it means standing against the crowd. Because every child deserves a cake. Every child deserves a lawn. Not a perfectly trimmed one. Not a lawn that checks boxes, just a patch of grass where they can laugh, play, be seen, and be free. The fight may have started with a cruel act, but it ends with something greater, a community that chose compassion over control. And if you're reading this now, maybe you're part of that new community. If this story moved you, stand with us. Speak for those who aren't heard. Share their stories. And never forget what one mother and one little girl showed the world. It only takes one voice to change everything. Movie Camera subscribed to HOA denied access for more real, raw, and powerful stories where justice always finds a way.